But now we're getting to the man himself. So, Jeff, my first question, how did you get into this world in the first place? Can you tell us just the broad arc of Jeff?
Yeah, I think so. I think I had the unusual circumstance of being able to sort of dabble in radio back when I was in high school. My high school had a little 10-watt FM broadcast station in the school that, especially as time's gone by, I've come to realize that absolutely nobody listened to, even my friends. And so, some friends and I would do radio shows in this high school thing. But I finally realized that no one at all was listening, but thankfully we were deluded to think that we were actually real DJs. And so I had some interest in radio just from being a music fan and enjoying music. And then when I got to college, I went to college in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was lucky enough that the radio station at the University of Pennsylvania is WXPN FM, which when I got there was a very eclectic, very weird, and very kind of crazy community radio, sort of that the cliche of American community radio of just being a kind of patchwork of music fanatics usually, and that's what XPN was like when I got there. I was getting a lot of community people, but as it turns out, people really, really deeply devoted to every imaginable genre of music, and so it was a very exciting thing to be able to volunteer on that radio station. So I did that really, again, just for fun. I don't think I ever imagined that I was going to do it for a living. And then shortly after graduating from college, I was just doing some, audio production work and audiovisual production work, just to make money. Nothing particularly inspiring.
Like
And some
live
people that
events,
I
that kind of thing?
exactly, business meetings and live events, and and really, not especially inspiring, but it paid the bills and allowed me to stay in Philadelphia and continue to volunteer at WXPN. And at some point, XPN sort of professionalized a little bit, and today it's still a very good radio station, but it's not as crazy and diverse as it was. However, it sort of knits back together in an interesting way. Again, a few years after graduating from college, some people that I'd met at WXPN, John DiLiberto and Kimberly Haas, had been doing a documentary series called Totally Wired, where they were going around the world and interviewing people in electronic sound, innovators in electronic music primarily, and they had started a new program for public radio in the United States called Echoes, and it turns out they needed some help, and so they sort of had say, "Hey, would you like to work with us on this?" And it seemed impractical at the time, but then as I investigated a little bit, going like, "Okay, wait a minute, they're offering to pay me to do what I like to do in my spare time," and so that sounds sort of interesting. And so it was a program once again built for national syndication to be on in the evenings in public radio around the country. And I don't think any of us had a whole lot of hope that it was going to survive, but we started in the fall of 1989, and 33 years later, we're still going. And so, amazingly enough, it's like, this fairly obscure, kind of strange music program is still going, syndicated on many stations around the country in the United States. And in the course of doing that program, uh, it's largely a music program. We put together a show, playing music from CDs and now downloads or whatever, recorded music. But we also interview musicians, and we also do live performances with musicians. And so, in the course of producing the show, which is 2 hours a night, 5 nights a week, and so kind of a pretty frantic production schedule, and we're a fairly small crew. Um, I really get a taste of a whole lot of the different edges of music production in terms of just banging out a 2 hour show of music, recorded music, but also interviewing people, editing and producing those into fairly concise, highly produced sort of interview segments. In terms of those tend to be maybe 10 to 15 minutes long, culled down from maybe an hour and a half long interview, but again, highly produced with narration and excerpts and music beds and music examples and things like that. And so it's not just a straight Q&A. And so there's a lot of production involved in those interview segments. And then the live recordings, again, well, that's everything from a solo guitarist to a large band that will either record. We've sometimes we joke about those contexts, something that we recorded in everything from closets to cathedrals, which is actually has been the case, from ending up in somebody's walk-in closet to record a harpist out in San Francisco because they're doing construction in the street in front of them. And we've also recorded Paul Winter up in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. More recently, we've ended up in recording studios. We sort of like the idea of sort of more casual performances outside of a formal recording studio, but just for practical sake, we've ended up in recording studios more often lately. But in the course of doing all of that, once again, it's like, I've kind of learned a lot of edges of music production. And in the course of that, there's an organization called AIR, AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio, again, sort of a public radio based organization that had a mailing list that a lot of people would ask for advice in the mailing list, and I would offer my technical advice. And so around that time, and once again, geez, I've lost track. It's like a little over, maybe I should know this off the top of my head, but I want to say maybe 12, 13 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. A really excellent radio producer named Jay Allison started Transom.org, which again is a website really sort of interested in bringing in diverse voices into public radio, and has sort of evolved over time to be not just public radio, but just sort of teaching people storytelling for audio production. And maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's public radio, maybe it's some other form that we're not even aware of now, but just sort of audio storytelling in a sort of documentary style. And there's all sorts of training information up on transom.org, way, way, way beyond my contributions. But I tend to offer the technical end of things, and I'll review equipment or software or techniques or things like that, in terms of just to sort of help people with the technical side of like learning software or hardware in order to create these audio stories. So that those are kind of the two big hats that I wear in terms of getting a regular radio show out the door every day, 5 days a week, 2 hours a night for Echoes. And then in my voluminous spare time, sort of again, writing about the technical end of production for Transom, and then picking up stream, I'll do some other little training things on the side there. So it's like I'm fairly sort of immersed in the sort of techniques and technology of audio production still.
So that is so much great information there.
To be concise.
Well, that's what I asked for. I wanted the arc. You gave us the arc. That's going to lead us into a few other questions, and really kind of talking about other DAWs in Hindenburg. First though, just for our folks who maybe are coming at this from another place, you said you're recording, so you're especially back in the day, behind the board recording. Maybe that's very different now. But if you're doing like recording a band with a drummer and all that stuff, can you talk about just the difference between setting that up versus recording like a conversation as we're doing now, or other things? Like if you didn't know about it and you're getting into this, maybe you're in a podcast, something. What is it like? Like recording a band, a drum set, mixing, and all that stuff.
Well, there are so many ways to approach it, and it's been an interesting thing just over time. Again, the way that technology has evolved, and that has evolved. Sorry, when we started, again, in 1989, it simply wasn't practical to multi-track, and in particular, the series we did, we called them living room concerts because the concept, the greater idea was that we would travel to musicians' homes and have them set up in their living room, or some informal setting, but generally not go to recording studios, and we would just show up. And at that time, like thankfully, just in the first year or two, I think we had a little Tascam mixer, but quickly, fairly early in the process, Mackie came out with their 1604, which was a fairly compact and good sounding 16-channel mixer that we could put in the trunk of a car and travel around with it. But back then, just because it was for practicalities reasons, we would record live to stereo. And so we would just show up, and even if it was a group with drums and multiple instruments, if we could keep it under 16 channels, it was like, and we were just kind of forced to keep it under 16 channels. We would just mic everybody up and embrace the bleed, and embrace the fact
Sure.
that like a lot of sound is going to be spilling into everybody else's microphones, and try to alleviate that a little bit. But basically, we were recording live to stereo as if we were live on the air. We never were.
Mhm.
Well, I think once or twice we were live on the air, but very rarely were we live on the air. Um, but we would record through that Mackie board, mixing directly to a DAT machine at the time, and we had some portable DAT machines and these relatively small mixers and some suitcases full of microphones, and we'd just do it in a very low tech way, really.
Can you just say what DAT is for those folks who don't know?
I'm sorry. So digital audio tape again. It seems so. It's amazing
I know.
how quickly everything sort of transitioned. In that, in 1989, that transition, when we started the show, that transition was just happening. We had previously done remote recording on portable cassette decks, and there were
Right.
sort of venerable old Sony and Marantz portable cassette decks made for mostly news gathering, really. But there were stereo versions that you could get a halfway decent sound out of. And actually, just tangentially, we've been going back to a lot of interviews done sort of in the mid 80s and late 80s that were done on cassette, and amazingly those have held up really well. And it turns out that, like, if you use a good cassette tape and you engineered it properly, those still sound pretty good, and we're really pleased. Whereas some of the early digital formats are actually falling apart, and some of those digital audio tapes that we made, some of the DAT recordings, are actually not playable anymore because the media has degraded.
Yeah.
And so it's
Interesting.
yeah, so it's one of those interesting things where it's like, analog, had some some quality issues. You get a little hiss, and, like, that it might degrade slowly over time, but it would degrade slowly. Whereas digital will tend to go over a cliff. It'll either play or it won't. It's like, or it'll play, and as it's falling apart, it'll sound terrible as it's falling apart. And so over time, we've tried, just as a quick tangent, we've tried to sort of you know duplicate off those digital audio tapes to other more stable formats. But again, as time goes by, what are those stable formats? We've done many times that we've encoded them and put them on a hard drive, and then had the hard drives fail, or put them on a CDR and then discover that 20 years later the CDRs aren't playing, and
Sure.
things like that. And so it's like, that's always a challenge. But to get back to the original thing again, initially it was all live to stereo, including we'd bring a little effects rack and put a little reverb or echo in on things, and so just to kind of give it a real sort of polished experience. But once again, practically speaking, I was sitting in the room with the band with headphones on, and we were sort of using the venerable Sony 7506s or V6s or whatever we had that isolate pretty well. So I'd be sitting in the room and mostly hearing what's coming through my headphones and mixing live with headphones. And looking back on it, I'm kind of amazed at how good those concerts sounded. I mean, they really turned out very nicely. That, again, it helps to have a lot of practice just in being sort of forced into that situation. Now, as time has gone by, it's nice to have the options. As time has gone by now, even in the fairly basic situations, I will now digitally multi-track either into a recorder or into the computer or both. And so we've just done a few recently, and I'm thrilled that I'm able to have again, for relatively controlled things, if I could keep it under 8 channels, I have a Sound Devices MixPre 10T that gives me eight excellent microphone inputs in a bag that I could carry over my shoulder. And so I could just sort of wire that up and do a basic rough mix. It's not quite as sophisticated as going through a mixer. Again, adding effects and things like that is not really practical, but I can at least track it. I can track it live to that machine, and I'll often record onto that machine and also hook it into the computer and just run a backup into any kind of computer programming. And incidentally, the last thing I did, I recorded into the MixPre 10T and also ran a Hindenburg session, just because, again, I wasn't doing anything fancy. Hindenburg is not really designed for music production, but if I'm just tracking, it's like it's nice and stable. And so I ended up at the end of the session, I had everything recorded onto the MixPre's memory cards and also onto my computer at the same time. And so I immediately just went in and started working on the Hindenburg session, because it's like, well, it's already in there, so I might as well. In this case, I didn't have to do any fancy engineering, and so the Hindenburg was just fine. Now, ultimately, for other projects with like larger band projects, I'll probably end up in Pro Tools, just because I need to do aux sends and groups and things like that that are more music based. It's just not what Hindenburg is designed for. But at the same time,
kind of my next question is that, following this journey of how you used to record, and that was, in analog,
Yeah.
and then the age of the DAWs happens, and so
Right.
there are all these recording programs, but they're made for music, so they're just made for a different thing. And then
Yeah.
people, as much of the news, journalism, and everything else has shifted to podcasting, etc., people are using music DAWs to do this other thing, which is drastically different. Can you talk a little bit? And we're not here to just talk about Hindenburg, though we love it.
Yeah.
But what is the difference between other DAWs, like it could be Pro Tools or whatever, and Hindenburg from your experience?
Yeah. Well, no, that's an excellent point where it's like, I mean, and I mean, I still do it now, and it's kind of funny, but especially at any kind of sort of, again, radio or audio gatherings, it's like, I feel like I should have a T-shirt printed up just saying it's like I'm not being paid by Hindenburg, but it's just kind of true. It's like, I mean, I've thankfully, it's like, been able to sort of get collaborate and had some great interactions with the Hindenburg crew at some of these conferences and things, but that I've gone to. But I just have keep sort of saying it's like, yeah, no, I'm just a fan in terms of, yeah, I'm not on the Hindenburg payroll, and it's like sometimes I think it seems
So
like it
he
is just
tells
because
you.
yeah, exactly. So I'm no, I'm so I am just a very enthusiastic about the program because again, to give a little background, once again, we were really at the dawn of the DAW doing the Echoes production. In that when we first started out, we were actually multi-tracking to half-inch analog tape, and so once again, we were producing the show to multi-track analog tape and then mixing it down to DAT and sending the DAT off to an uplink to get it sent to stations. And that was a very tedious process. And so, we had the sort of, kind of, classic studio setup where I had actually three stereo reel-to-reel recorders and then a stack of CD players and then two 8-track multi-track half-inch machines that we'd use. Well, they were continually going down, so we like sort of needed to have a backup because they just were a little flaky because, well, machines are flaky.
And
um,
these are not cheap to repair, by the way. These are like
Absolutely
specialty
not.
item
Yeah.
things. Anyway,
No,
okay.
not cheap to buy or repair,
Yeah.
and so it's like, so that was a very sort of tedious process. So as soon as DATs came out, I mean, as DAWs came out, sort of digital audio workstations came out, it's like we just jumped on it because we could see that that's exactly what we needed. And again, and that was in the very, very early days where there was like Studer Diaxis and um, um, we Pro Tools was in its infancy at the time. I'm not sure it was even, might have just been Sound Designer when it first came out. I'm not even sure it was called Pro Tools initially.
I think
Um,
Digital Performer might have been out in those days, I think. Maybe that's
Possibly, I
it.
was going to say it's like, but yeah, but that was a little more of a MIDI program with a little bit of audio thrown on. It's
Yeah.
like, so there were a few of those around. We ultimately went with Sonic Solutions, which was a very expensive and very sort of esoteric program, which interestingly enough was designed kind of more for mastering than for like music production. And so oddly enough, that was a good fit for us, and that like it actually ended up being a pretty good model with a lot of sort of cutting and pasting and montaging, which interestingly enough is not completely alien to the Sonic to the Hindenburg sort of way of working in terms of like it wasn't so much emulating a multi-track tape recorder and emulating sort of music studio processes again with aux sends and groups and things like that. It was more like put this sound file here, change the volume, put the sound file here, change the volume, and it had incredibly elegant crossfading capabilities and things like that. And so I actually really loved working in Sonic Solutions, but it was a very expensive program. It was a little finicky. You had to use very specific expensive hard drives and things like that, and eventually they just sort of fell behind with just basic processing things that we found we needed. And so eventually we toggled over to Pro Tools, and we're doing the show in Pro Tools. But for many, many years, sort of longtime DAW users are probably aware that Pro Tools basically had a real time bounce for many, 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 many years. And so it's like once you put your multi track session together, if you wanted to bounce that session out, it went in real time. And so, me doing a 2 hour long radio show every day, I can't tell you how many evenings I spent at the studio white knuckling the desk, hoping that the bounce was going to go properly, because it very often would go to an hour and 45 and then stop. And I would have nothing. I'd have to start it again. And it was incredibly frustrating. Now,
I don't miss
obviously
any of
things
those
have
days.
yeah, right.
Any of
No,
that.
there were a few clunky workarounds for that, but ultimately it was just a very sort of frustrating process. But I was looking at various alternatives, but honestly, when I first came across Hindenburg, I had actually never imagined that we would do echoes in Hindenburg. Just because when I first encountered it, it sort of seemed like, oh, this is a very clever program that's really good for new producers that are not especially technically adept. And that's obviously that's whole sort of raison d'etre, it
Mhm.
just sort of be for the non-technical person. And so I wrote it up for Transom, because that's part of Transom's sort of mission as well, is to get people into storytelling that aren't necessarily accomplished engineers or super experienced people. So it seemed like absolutely perfect for the Transom environment in terms of like, here's a way to get people in and recording and producing and putting together relatively sophisticated productions without a whole lot of technical knowledge. But as I was working with it, as I was reviewing it, I just kept going like, well, that's awfully clever. And well, that's awfully handy. And well, that's kind of efficient to do it this way. And it suddenly occurred to me, like, well, let me just try doing my 2 hour radio show in this. And I just discovered that a lot of the very just sort of basic structural uh, 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 processes of Hindenburg, of the auto leveling, of your inputs, that used to just drive me crazy, take me a huge amount of time to get individual recorded tracks to even levels, to get the dialogue at even levels, get the dialogue and the music evened out, all that kind of thing was suddenly really super simple and good sounding in Hindenburg. And so all of a sudden I was going, wait a minute, I think I can do my radio show not only faster but better. Like it's coming out sounding better than doing it in other Pro Tools, because just sometimes you might as well let the machine do things that machines are good at, and doing things like that, like being able to do a quick analysis and doing a loudness normalization on a file. That was not routine in other DAWs now, and it's a little more common these days, but that was an unusual thing at the time. And so just sort of putting together the show suddenly became much more efficient, and suddenly realized going, oh, okay, that's a good thing. And then it took us a little while to transition because, as I mentioned, our interview features are fairly complex in terms of just with a lot of music beds and music posts, and like just a lot of dense crossfades and things like that. And so we sort of stayed in Pro Tools for a little while with that. But then again, I had a similar sort of revelation that one time, I don't remember what the circumstance was. I was like, well, let me just do this in Hindenburg because I needed to. And suddenly realized, like, going, oh, wait a minute, I can do this just as well. Maybe, again, maybe better, maybe faster in Hindenburg, that I really thought I needed a real flamethrower of a DAW, of something like Pro Tools, like that was a real, high end professional production device. And in the end, I realized, like, no, I'm actually getting better results and working faster and better in Hindenburg. And I'm at a point right now where simply the existence of the clipboards in Hindenburg have spoiled me so much that I just don't know if I can produce in another DAW in any
This
sort of
new
efficient
stuff
way.
to spoil you coming too with the
Yeah.
clipboards, actually.
Well, right,
Yeah.
right. Well, exactly. And I was going to say, so I think, there's several things coming down the pipe, I think, that are going to be very exciting. But it's one of these
Yeah.
things where just and again, as I show it to people now, once again, even fairly sophisticated producers that are very set in their ways, a lot of times if I sort of show ways to use the clipboard, that all of a sudden people are like, oh, wow. And it's like, it is sort of amazing to me that that kind of workflow is not inherent in other machines. And hopefully I hope other programs do adopt it because it's so incredibly useful. And so,
Honestly, I
yeah,
say, like, I use other DAWs for other things, like,
yeah,
music stuff, and I
yeah,
had the exact same experience. The clipboard is probably the feature for me personally, where I'm so used to doing that, that when if I was in another DAW, like I wanted to just put a clip somewhere, like, oh, I have to like hide a track or like put it. It's like, can I just put the thing in here and then grab it when I need it? And it's and
yeah.
Pro Tools has like a list of every clip. So if you make a cut, it makes a new clip, and etc. It's not the same in how that works. And it's like, anyway, just
Yeah.
a little different.
No,
Your check's in
no,
the
that
mail, by the way.
yeah, right, right. Yeah, no, no, that quickly, that like, yeah, like just, I mean, I feel like any other programs, like very quickly, like their quote unquote bin of clips, just very quickly gets confusing and
Yeah.
cumbersome, and and I've seen people with fairly clever ways to work around that, but none of them are as good as just organizing your clipboards properly. And none of them have just like, again, there's this is a silly thing, but for instance, just doing a 2-hour radio show every single day, any kind of efficiency is always appreciated. And so, for instance, what I do is like, and especially now in sort of COVID times, but it's just not too different back when we were all together in the studio. But now I'm working from home by myself, and the sort of the senior producer of the program, and who's the narrator and the host of the show. He's recording himself in his own studio, and he just sends me a file, and I deal with the file. But ultimately, my workflow is, for instance, the narration. I just get one big file with all the narration for the show,
Hmm.
but that just needs to get broken up into like 25 different little chunks. And so I'll go through and just clean up that narration and, pick up any false starts or cut together any discontinuities, level it out, like, make sure everything, get rid of mouth noises, things like that. But then I'll end up with a whole bunch of little clips that I've grouped together. And then it took me a little while to figure it actually, I honestly, I can't remember whether, again, just have a great time pestering Prayman about like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if this would happen? And then every once in a while he'll go like, oh yeah, you just do this, and it's already in there. Or
Yeah.
it's been a couple of times that I've also been like, geez, it'd be really great if this did this. Then you'd be like, update your software, it does it now. And it's just sort of like, oh well, kind of cool. But for instance, just the very basic thing like that I have, again, a narration that's made up of a whole bunch of little clips that are in a track, but now I literally highlight them all and use a short key just to throw them all into a bin in order, uh, in one step. That, again, when I show this to other producers working in other programs, they're just like, wait, whoa, wait, what just happened there? And it's just like, I've just done my work, and now everything's in order in a bin ready to go. And then I go back and put everything where it's supposed to be with short key, with hotkeys, and just sort of knock them in there. And it's just sort of like, people are sort of, wait, you're not just sort of randomly dragging. It's like, no, I'm putting these precisely where they want to be. And also, again, I don't know
It's
that this
gonna
is
get
what
easier.
they.
I promise.
Oh,
It's gonna
yeah,
get
oh no,
easier as of
I have
soon,
I have no
like
doubt.
Monday.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I also, and again, this is a specific thing for my need, but it just coincidentally the way that my radio show goes. It's a 2-hour long radio show, but the practicalities of being out a nationally syndicated show is that individual radio stations don't really want a single file. They want it broken up into little individual segments so that they can do a bottom of the hour cutaway, and they can do a news cutaway perhaps, and so our show is formatted with like a 1 minute billboard at the top of the hour, and then there's a 5 minute chunk that a station could drop and cut away to live news, and then there's a segment that goes to the bottom of the hour, and then it stops, and so they can insert a local promo at the bottom of the hour if they want. Then it goes back to the top of the hour, but gives them room to do another promo before the top of the hour, and then does the whole thing over again for the second hour. So ultimately, I need to upload 13 discrete segments
Mhm.
just to allow stations to throw it in their automation and be flexible with it. And so once again, this just, when I was working in other DAWs, I would have to, like, I would bounce out a coherent program, and then I'd open in another program in a destructive editor and chop it into pieces, which just ended up being a little better than sort of doing these individual bounces of. But with Hindenburg, I literally just lay chapter markers down, and again, with a single keystroke, it just spits out exactly what I need at precisely the right levels, and so it's always exactly the right length with exactly the right level, and it's just like such an incredible like load off my mind compared to how I used to have to do it with other software. So once again, I mean, as you mentioned, I still have Pro Tools on my computer, and I use it for music mixing if I'm doing a multi-track session with a band or something like that, because that's the
Right.
appropriate tool for the job. But when I'm making a radio show, whether again, if it tends to be like an interview based feature with, again, a narrator and maybe a Q&A, or certainly a narrator, and then actualities from the interviewee with illustrative music examples or ambience or whatever. I can't picture a better model than the way Hindenburg works. It's like I've gotten to a point where I'm so used to that I just do it like that, and I just when I'm occasionally forced to use another program, I'm just like, huh, I'm sure it's not just a habit, but it's just like, well, I can do it, but boy, it's so clunky now. And
Yeah.
so, and again, now it's one of those things, as I know, you've hinted a little bit, and it's one of those things that again, not I'm not paid by Hindenburg, but I do respect the fact that it's like, I mean, I actually was a little frustrated for all, because it's like I was aware of some super cool things that it was capable of doing, and it still wasn't doing it. But I appreciate the fact that they were like, no, it's not quite right. No, it's not quite right yet. No, it's not quite right yet. And so the fact that they're not putting stuff out that's like quirky and buggy and like, well, it's sort of kind of works. Now, again, I get the impression that there's some of that cool stuff is actually working now, and that's going to be very exciting.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. So we'll get
yeah,
into this. So next Monday there'll be a launch of the beta for 2.0, and we'll be talking all about it and showing it. But yes,
yeah,
there are a lot of really exciting features that we've been working on in the background for a while,
yeah,
and yeah, and it's a beta, so stuff. The purpose of a beta is to kind of see if anything
of course,
does go wrong. But yeah, I
yeah,
mean, progressive refinement. Try to. I was breaking it, trying as hard as I could to break it last night. So with Prabin, who's up at 4:30 in the
right,
morning. It's
right,
just
right.
insane. So
Well, I mean,
anyway,
if history is any indication, I think I'll find ways to break it, and I will be waking Raymond up in the middle of the night
sure.
and going, dude, this just happened. What's going on? And so,
But hopefully it's the goal is for it not to break, because we've done all the
right,
breaking for you, as
right,
much as we possibly can. So all right, many of our listeners, but group members, folks that are watching this, are coming into this and are coming, not from the long history of radio, which is how you got into it.
yeah,
But so some parts of it now, again, as you've mentioned, the goal of Hindenburg is to make everything very accessible for people, because if you don't know much, or you can't really talk about uh, uh, float, it doesn't really have any bearing on the story that you're going to tell. But some part of the technical things can still be overwhelming for folks. So I'm going to ask you to do something that's essentially impossible. But I wondered if you could just demystify a couple of these features for people. So when they basically, I mean, we can't get into all of it because these, it's
right,
just too much. But how about sample rates? Like, what do people need to know if they're setting that stuff up? I think most
yeah,
people kind of have an idea, or a lot of folks know about LUFS and as it goes out. But things that are still, I just answered a support ticket a while ago where someone said, I can't raise the volume on my track up and down. I think it's because of the float. And I was like, well, that's not really, that's
right.
the separate. You're not thinking about it correctly, which is fine. You just don't know. So how about basically the difference between bit rate and sample rate, and like where things need to be set, or what are like industry standards for those things, making it easy for
Right.
folks who don't know so much.
No, absolutely, and now it's like, some engineer, gave me the sort of, kind of entertaining phrase one time. It's like, yeah, the beautiful thing about standards is you can have so many of them, and that's one of the problems, is that it's like, there's never one sort of stable standard. And to be honest, I still, to this day, I'm slightly mystified as to why there ended up being sort of these two camps early on of sort of quote unquote professional audio being standardized at 44.1 sample rates, in terms of like, if you had CDs were had 44.1 kilohertz sample rates, whereas digital video standardized at 48. And they're functionally the same, and I'm always kind of have to catch myself laughing every once in a while. People going, "Oh no, I always do it at 48 for the better sound quality," and like, that's indistinguishable sound quality between 44.1 and 48. um, but it's just sort of like, well, again, what are you doing if you're producing for video? If you're going to be interacting with the video world, then it certainly makes sense to stay at 48. But like in my particular circumstance, even to this day, I'm still working at 44.1, because we're using a lot of audio from CDs. Still, I mean, it's becoming more and more downloads, and more digital files that, again, can be at various sample rates, but it still does seem to be primarily at 44.1 for commercially released music.
And what
And
does this
so,
sampling mean? What does it
well,
mean?
so the sampling means is, again, it's basically like, well, I back in the day, we used to use the analogy of again of of a film frame, and it's like snapshots, putting a film together. But I don't know if that necessarily translates to people these days. But it basically is a series of like the sort of the number of snapshots per second that the audio recorder is making to basically try to simulate the real time analog signal. And so the more snapshots you take, the closer to reality you can get. But once again, practically speaking, now again, this is sort of leading into it. It's probably where you're sort of trying to lead me with this, is that most recorders now can record, be it software or a hardware field recorder, can record at higher sample rates that's now available. That's not simply the toggle between 44.1 or 48 kilohertz, which were chosen very specifically because there's a phenomenon called aliasing, that when you're making a digital signal, you end up with some weird noise sort of way up in the higher frequencies, and it's related to how many samples per second you're taking. And so, as it turns out, those like 40,000 samples per second, 40,000 and above, allowed the engineers to put a digital filter just a little above 20,000 hertz, which would knock that aliasing noise down. And basically, our human ears can't hear above 20,000 hertz, anyways. And me being an elderly person, I can't hear anywhere near close to 20,000 hertz now. So I'm certainly down in the teens somewhere. But it's just one of those things where these higher sample rates, now it's quite routine to see, 88 or 96, 128. And I think that's still up for debate. And I personally still don't tend to use those higher sample rates personally, especially when I'm out recording in the field. Because at least for radio production, for audio production, I'm not finding that useful. Now, if I was going to make a record, in particular, if I was going to make say a classical music record or some like acoustic music, very delicate, detailed music, I might record at those higher sample rates in a studio. Basically, it allows you to capture higher frequencies, which I think there's a reasonable question as to what's the point of recording higher frequencies if we can't hear them. But at the same time, I think there are people I trust who just abstractly say it just sounds better, and it's like, I suppose I can believe that, but for practical purposes, still going out in the field and recording, I still recommend people, if they're recording an interview or even like a live performance or something to be used ultimately for a radio program or a podcast, 44.1 or 48K is really sufficient, because your final production is going to get dumbed down to get broadcast or to get streamed, as a podcast file or a data file or any kind of streaming audio. It's losing a lot of audio quality in the end. Now, I'm a huge advocate for trying to start out with as high quality audio as you can, and wait till the very last process to dumb it down, to sort of to make it more efficient to deliver. And so when you're recording out in the field, I always encourage people to not record MP3s or not record any kind of compressed audio file like that. Record a WAV file at 44.1 or 48K.
Can you just
Yeah.
because this often gets confused for people, and I understand because it's the same word. You're
Yeah.
saying you're talking about file compression,
File
and
compression.
sometimes
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
folks, right, which is of course compression, but some folks mistake that with a compressor in DAW or music and that kind of
Right.
thing. So can you just talk about what you
Right.
mean by it loses some going from a wave to an MP3?
Yeah. So it's an unfortunate overlap of terminology. Although I would say I also would encourage people out in the field to not use audio compression if it's possible to avoid either. Which again, we'll segue into our next topic of it. Because once again, you're kind of committed to that in the field, whereas like you might want to be able to adjust that later more carefully. But the idea of file compression is a matter of like, a WAV file or an AFF file, but basically like a PCM audio file that again is as close to possible to the original audio. It's pretty big in terms of so if you've done a 16 or 24 bit audio recording that we'll talk about in a second at 44.1 or 48K, it's a large file and it's basically inefficient to send that file to people. Now, again, is that going to change in the future as people's bandwidth goes up? Maybe. But at the same time, probably not, only because as it turns out, like most users don't seem to mind getting a sort of compressed file. And so some very clever engineers came up with some algorithms that they figured out how to throw away certain aspects of the audio file and make a smaller data file that still sounded pretty close to the original. And so the more audio you throw away and the sort of smaller your file gets, the more artifacts you get, and the sort of less similar it is to the original. But it's actually kind of alarming how much you can throw away and it still sounds close enough that a lot of people don't care. Hence, podcasts tend to be MP3s or AIFFs or AAFs. I'm sorry, it's like I actually use AAF, and but just because I like the sound of the encoding a little better. But it's just one of these things where similarly, if a radio, an FM radio broadcast, once again, is bandwidth limited, and so first of all, it's distributed as an MP2, which is again sort of like a flavor of an MP3. It's a compressed file, but just less compressed than the MP3, and so basically, almost everything that you're doing in a practical sense, if you're making a radio program or making a podcast or putting a file up on your website to stream or anything like that, it's going to probably end up being compressed. Now, once again, there's some talk occasional, especially in the music world, about offering high resolution files for distribution finally, and maybe ambisonic surround files, and like we'll see if that comes to fruition. But for right now, practically speaking, if you're making a radio show or a podcast, you're probably going to end up sort of with a compromised final product. But you want to sort of wait until the very end if you can. You want to record in the field your original at as high a resolution as is practical, just because if you continually multiply compress data compression, if you keep throwing away little bits of audio at multiple stages, then your sound can really fall apart. And I've had that happen to me, and it's like, thankfully it's been a while since that's happened, but I literally had it happen one time that I was listening to my radio show live on the air and going, what has happened? And I figured out, going, oh, because of an emergency situation, we had to like send a file to someone who treated it this way, and ultimately got compressed multiple times, and ultimately what was coming out of my radio did not sound like what I made, and so it was a little distressing to do. And so once again, when you're out in the field, you really do want to record a WAV file at as high a resolution as is practical. And once again, right now at this point in history, I think 16 or 24-bit is fine. 32-bit is becoming more common, and once again, we'll talk about exactly what that is. But sample rates, once again, I still think 44.1 or 48 is fine, unless you're doing something really esoteric, at which point you might just want to sort of discuss with anybody you're collaborating with. It's like, oh, do I need to be at 96K, or do I need to be at 88.2 or something like that, and sort of just discuss what the project needs. But for now, I pretty much record everything at 44.1 or 48 still. It's certainly out of the field with a field recorder. Now, the other interesting aspect is, again, we've been throwing around these bit depths thing, and so the use of bit depth sort of correlates to the amount of dynamic range.
I just
Absolutely,
want to go over real quick, just the so samples are the audio coming in and the audio as it goes out. As you said, when you compress it, meaning changing it from like a wave to an MP3 or something, you lose some of that information.
That's right.
But it sounds as if, so everything you've ever heard on YouTube, Spotify, et cetera, it has been compressed from its original thing, but you may not have ever known. Certainly the general population doesn't seem to know. But what are these bits and floats?
right, exactly. So the bits, it gets even more confusing. But with the bits, so that basically is correlating to the amount of dynamic range that you have in terms of the sort of the difference between the quietest sound you can record and the loudest sound you can record. And so 16-bit once again was sort of like landed upon as sort of the standard for many years of digital audio. So once again, any CD that you have is at 16 bits, and that's a lot. You'd think there's there's a lot of classical music and other types of music encoded at 16 bits that has a pretty dramatic dynamic range. It's like it's pretty. 16-bit is really sufficient if you've engineered it carefully. That's really enough room to give you a difference between, again, very quiet sounds and very loud sounds in a practical sense in terms of what our ears can handle, what our stereo systems can handle. That's really enough. Now, that being said, 24-bit gives you more dynamic range. And so it basically lets you record quieter sounds with appropriate resolution that you can, so you can still hear those and distinguish those, and then gives you more room in terms of like of handling louder sounds. And so the amount of dynamic range that a 24-bit signal, if it's engineered correctly, is really exceeds our capability of hearing. And so that really ought to be sufficient. 24-bit should be sufficient for any kind of practical audio work that we're doing. Now, what's interesting is, again, the engineers have come up with what's now being called 32-bit float, and so there's two things happening there. One, 32-bit, just by the math that we're talking about, 24-bit gave you more dynamic range than 16-bit, so therefore 32-bit would give you more dynamic range than 24-bit would. But it's the float part that actually is really the dramatic thing. Is it's just the way that the math is going. And yeah, I don't know if you have an appropriate visual aid. I'm sorry, I have one. I tried. I did an article on Transom not too long ago about this, and I tried to make I was trying to make graphics, uh, just in some program on my computer, and I just realized it kept being impossible to actually display this properly. The incredibly dramatic difference between the dynamic range available with 32-bit float compared to 24 and 16. And any graphic I made, you literally couldn't see the dynamic range of 16 or 24 compared to the 32-bit. They're so out of scale. Is that basically 32-bit can handle audio levels way beyond what we could even tolerate in terms of, like, there's a level of pain that, again, our ears can't handle a certain level of audio. And no sort of devices, no like playback devices could handle the amount of dynamic range that 32-bit is capable of encoding. But the consequence of that is, but the fact that the math is able to encode a dramatic dynamic range. So in combination with, like, it's like, well, the field recorders, at least at this point, the way they're doing it is they tend to have two different encoders. That one will encode very sort of low level quiet signals, and another one will encode higher volume louder signals, and then they sort of knit them back together, such that the reality is, if you record in 32-bit float in the field, you can capture really anything that you would encounter in nature, in terms of, you could a very, very quiet sound and a very, very loud sound will all be encoded properly, and you won't have to worry about, did your signal clip on the way in, because clipping happens if you've got too loud of a sound coming into your recorder, and it just can't handle all that much volume. And then again, older recorders, and even current recorders at 16 or 24-bit, if you record really, really, really quietly, then you have to turn it up later in your digital workstation, and that's going to bring up a lot of noise. And so it's not really ideal. So the fact that these 32-bit recorders can actually record a good amount of detail down in the very, very quiet sections, and so you can just turn it up in your DAW and it comes back and sounds great. And similarly, if you have something really, really loud, you can just turn it down and you get it back into a range that's usable, but it's not distorting. It's kind of amazing. And so, and there's pros and cons to this. And like, on one level, it's just incredible to not worry about this. And so, I mean, I was a skeptic for a long time. I mean, I'm old enough and I'm sort of like set in my ways enough that I sort of thought, like, yeah, this doesn't make any sense to me. There's something to be said for setting your levels properly. Um, but I've come to, like, as I've just started using some of these recorders, it's just kind of mind blowing to be able to just hook things up and just sort of like, I can worry about it later. I don't need to be concerned in real time about whether I'm getting my levels correct, because the recorder's handling it, and I can just deal with it when I'm editing and mixing later. Now, that creates more work for you later, in terms of, like, if you're not setting your levels carefully as you're mixing and editing, you're going to have more work to do. And if you're coding things that are very quiet and very loud, you're going to have a lot more leveling to do as you mix later. At the same
And
time, it's
just
nice to have, yeah,
a practical consideration for folks might be:
yeah,
are you realistically recording a butterfly's wings flapping next to a
right.
bus honking? and need
Right.
to hear them both at the same
Yeah.
time.
So do you need, because the reality of the situation is if you have a good recorder and you've set your levels carefully, 24-bit is lots of dynamic range. And so you should be able, you can do it fine at 24-bit. That being said, for instance, I decided to see, like, okay, what's a use case that might be, might need this kind of thing. And I realized this comes up occasionally. I thought, like, well, let's say you need to record gunshots for some reason. It's like, maybe it's something that's happening, or maybe you're just like, doing a story about a shooting range or something like that. So I found an outdoor shooting range, and I went up there and I recorded with a couple different recorders. There's this little Zoom F3, which again is amazing, like this little tiny thing with two XLRs and no, hit record and go. There's no input controls. There's also this little Zoom. It's the F2, and it's got basically a little mini input. It comes with a lavalier, but you can plug a different kind of mic in there if you want. Or there's this Tascam X8 that, once again, built-in mics does that. Or I have the MixPre 3, the MixPres, and the Zoom F8 also will do that. And I discovered two interesting things. For one, is that yes, in order to encode something like that, especially, I mean, if you're recording somebody talking, and then there's gunfire, even in the distance, that's so loud that indeed you need a lot more dynamic range than your typical 16 or 24-bit file is going to allow you. And so, so you actually, in a weird circumstance, in like a circumstance like that, and similarly, I did the same thing on the July 4th fireworks display. I did a thing where I was talking with a friend, but then there were fireworks going, and it turns out like that's very loud. And so it's just a matter of like being able to encode that in the field is very difficult, and this 32-bit float suddenly makes it achievable, with the one caveat that you just have to realize that we are in the real world here. And so, yes, theoretically the math can encode dramatically, huge dynamic ranges, but can the rest of your equipment handle that? And so even just microphones, they have a practical physical limit of how much sound pressure they can handle. And so, for instance, as I was recording the gunshots, actually, and the fireworks too, as a test, I recorded both with some dynamic microphones that are relatively less sensitive, and so they can handle loud sounds a little better. And I recorded with some condenser microphones that are more sensitive, and they handle quieter sounds better, the more detailed. But it turns out the condenser microphones all could not handle that level coming from either the gunshots or the fireworks. And so those signals had some clipping to them,
Then what
simply
does the
because it
float
clipped it.
matter?
Right,
Yeah.
right. So the float doesn't
Yeah.
matter because, like, the microphone got overloaded, and so the
Yeah.
microphone distorted, and so I was recording a very lovely, clean signal of a distorted microphone. Whereas but at the same time, the dynamic microphones did pretty well, and so in that circumstance, so I was able to get that incredibly dramatic dynamic range by, okay, I had a quieter sound with the people talking, but I'm able to turn that up later. And then I have the super loud sounds got encoded pretty well, at least closer. They handled it better than the condenser mics did. And so there's, again, circumstances like that. Now that seems like an extreme example, but there's plenty of things that approach that. Of, let's say you're covering a parade and the drum corps goes by, or there just recently was like the Lunar New Year, and it's like, I know down in Chinatowns in cities around here, there's like a dragon dance, and they're lighting off firecrackers and playing drums and cymbals, and it's like, so if you're trying to record something like that, that's unexpectedly loud sounds that you may not be ready for. And so the fact that there are now recorders that can capture that more practically. Now you still have to have a little bit of consideration in terms of like, what kind of microphone am I using, how close am I getting, where's my mic pointing. There's still things to consider about this, but the fact that there technologically are recorders that can grab this massive dynamic range, I think is going to be pretty transformational. And this is always a problem, and especially there's a lot of scenarios where, again, people, again, especially nowadays with people trying to do remote recording, sometimes it's become a tactic sometimes that you might mail your interviewee a recorder. to record themselves, just because again the sound over the internet is always kind of compromised, and even some of like this sort of conferencing programs that attempt to solve that by recording locally, there's still we've had some problems with those sometimes. And so like when push comes to shove, it's kind of nice if you can give somebody a good recorder to record themselves on their end and then send you the file. But once again, if they're not an experienced engineer, are they going to set the levels correctly? And so now the fact that you could send them a small recorder with a 32-bit float format, they don't have to set the levels properly. Now they still need to position the mic well. They still need to try not to pop their microphone. They need to like try to not be in an echoey room. There's other considerations of getting a good recording, but at least the levels, which is a big thing, maybe you don't have to worry about that going forward. Maybe if you're using a 32-bit float recorder, maybe like that, I think that's ultimately going to be an amazing sort of advance of like going like, wow, that used to be a big pain in the neck, and it probably is not so much of a concern anymore. With that caveat that you're making more work for yourself later, that you're going, you're going to have to, you're having a file that has really dramatic differences that you're going to have to get back into the reasonable range that a human could listen to. And so you're still going to have to do some leveling on your own, either manually or using a compressor or limiter to get things back to where it can sound good. So but again, the capability of starting with 32-bit float is kind of amazing. And again, I started as a skeptic, and I'm becoming more and more enamored of it as time goes by. So we'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah.
But it's a great use case of the practicality of it, actually.
Yeah.
So much stuff, but we have a couple of questions from the audience. So thank you very much for everybody here in AirMeet for putting the in questions in the chat. So here is one of them, which you talked a little bit, but could you just maybe just go over again? How do you utilize the clipboard in your workflow?
Yeah. So once again, I found it incredibly useful and actually almost crucial at this point. I can't really picture you working without it. Now that basically I assign different clipboards to different things. Clipboard number 1 happens to be my narration. Clipboard number 2 might be like again one speaker. If it, like let's say that I'm producing an interview feature, and let's say there's like 2 or 3 people talking so my clipboard number 1 will be the narration, and then clipboard number 2 might be speaker number 1, and clipboard number 3 might be speaker number 2, and then clipboard number 4 might be music, and clipboard number 5 might be ambience, and I'll just sort of have all those things available and labeled properly so I can just sort of see what they are. And I've probably just with my workflow, I've probably grabbed we work from a script, we write a script for these things. And so I've probably grabbed all the audio in order anyways, and I've sort of made a rough cut. And so by the time I put it in the clipboard, it's probably in the right order anyways, but it's just sort of nice that I can sort of, move things around or pull them out in different orders if I want. But just having them visible, that as I start producing the show, then I'll have a bin with a bunch of, music or ambience beds, and I'll pull one in from there, and then find a good point that I want my narrator to start, and I'll drag the narration into its own track, and then duck the music or ambience down under the narrator. And then at the end of the narrator, I'll just I'll drop my cursor and then use a hotkey to drop the actuality from the interviewee at that spot, and then just sort of progress from there. Just having it organized with, okay, all my narrations in bin 1 and all my interviewees in bin 2, and if there's another interviewee, that's in bin 3, my music's in bin 4. It's incredibly efficient to be able to do that, and and you can audition from that too. You can just hit the little triangle on the left and you can go, is that the right one? Is this the music I want? Incredibly useful. And then I mean, in the other use case of, again, I'm doing a radio show. I do a 2-hour radio show every day, and that often is, some of the shows are purely just playing pre-recorded music, again, from CDs or downloads or whatever. And in that case, we might have, again, well, my bin number 1 is still my narrator. I'm making a radio show, so I still have narration to put in. But then bin number 2 might be acoustic tracks, and bin number 3 might be electronic tracks, and bin number 3 might be vocal tracks, or just any kind of delineation that I'm trying to mix my program in a sort of coherent way, so that I can just look over quickly and go, oh yeah, I need another acoustic track. Okay. And so I'm not looking through everything and pulling through, and just being able to organize that visually and quickly it's just such it's really crucial to me now. I can't picture working without it. It's like it's really pretty great. Now I have one quick anecdote. One anecdote. One time I was talking with someone that had done very long, extensive interviews with a few different people in her neighborhood, and was trying to put a piece together. She started asking, she's like, "Is there a limit to the number of clips you can have?" And I thought, like, geez, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you can make a lot of clipboards in terms, I think you can make up to 10 clipboards currently. Whether that's changed or not, I don't know. But again, I contacted. Again, I probably pray, but and just asked somebody at Hindenburg, said, like, yeah, is there a limit? They were like, well, I mean, I think, again, I'm 99% sure of this figure, that it was like, well, you can put 75 clips in a clipboard, and there's 10 different clipboards, and so yeah, you have to stop at 750 clips. And so I kind of went back to this person that was working on the project and saying, oh, okay, I guess I ran out, and I'm going like, okay, that's too many clips to like be
Right.
working with. It's like,
what is this
okay,
show?
yeah, right, exactly. You need to be a little bit more, discriminating when you're like choosing your clips that might go in your program, that you're not going to use 750 of them. But at the same time, it's kind of amazing that you could have something approaching that number of options. And if you're doing something, you could indeed have a whole bunch of edited clips in your clipboard and just choose from that vast array and sort of, and have them at least, again, organized a little more than just a one giant bin of things that you have to look through. So
Okay.
but there is a limit, but it's pretty big. So
I had we had a support question one time. It was somebody who they said they thought that they had just too many audio tracks. I was like, oh, I don't know. I don't think that's possible. Or just the file was too long. And I thought, really? What they had done is they never created new sessions. So they had one session, and everything they ever recorded was just in this session. And it was like hundreds of hours of audio. I was like, okay,
right.
if you do that, I mean, I guess. All right,
some point, yeah.
At some point, I mean, yeah. All right, so a couple of more great questions here. What's the difference between LUFS and bits?
Well, I mean, that's more of a. I mean, they're sort of related. Those are both sort of ways to look at dynamic range of an audio recording, in terms of, again, the bits, the larger number of bits, the sort of the more dynamic range you have available to you. And so, in theory, you could you could record something extremely loud with even 24-bit, but certainly with 32-bit, you could have something that was extremely, extremely loud. Now, ultimately, in order to make it listenable to people, you need to get it within a reasonable range of, like, what's practical for somebody to listen to. Get our, what is sort of pleasant to listen to is a relatively narrow range between what's physically possible of encoding. And so you want to get things within a reasonable level. And that's where the LUFs come in, and sort of those sort of loudness units. Again, the FS is compared to full scale. So that's just the way we count them. So loudness units down from 0. And so 0 is like your absolute limit. And so the loudness units, and again, the standard tends to be, in most places for broadcast, somewhere between -23, -24, depending on where you are. And they're, basically indiscriminate. That, once again, that's looking at an average level. So the average level of your sound, if you have it around there, then it's going to be pretty listenable and still have enough dynamic range that it'll sound natural, that you can get louder and you can get softer, and it'll still sound pretty normal. Whereas, once again, if you've recorded something at an extremely high bit rate, you might have something that's way too loud or too soft, and you're going to need to regulate that. You're going to need to go in and manually adjust the level of the clip, and or maybe apply some processing, like use compression or limiting. That's going to basically do that automatically. It's going to respond to the audio file and just sort of make those differences between the loud and soft a little bit more even. And so if you do that by using the LUFS display and or a target of LUFS, or you can output at a certain LUFS level, that everything is going to be again at an average level, so it's going to sound even. So, like, again, that loudness units are meant to sort of simulate how our ears work. And so if you have everything at a fairly consistent loofs signal, no matter what number you choose. In the for what it's worth, in the podcasting world, as I made the joke before about, oh, it's so great to have some standards because there can be so many. There's not really a standard for podcasting, except it sort of seems that somewhere between -18 or -16 has become a standard for podcasting. That's a little loud, in that it doesn't give you that much dynamic range anymore. So the
Goes the other
difference between your
direction too.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
the higher the number, what am I saying? The higher the number, the louder it is. Is that right?
Actually,
No, the lower the
actually,
number.
the lower the number.
number.
Straight,
Yeah,
because we're counting backward
counterintuitive.
from zero.
Yeah.
So no, it doesn't make any sense. But so 16 -16 loofs is louder on average than -24 loofs, and so it's just one of those things. But I think it's been chosen because so many podcasts just generally are somebody talking, and so you don't really need so much dynamic range for that. Whereas people that, like, you again put those standards in at -23 and 24, we're keeping in mind that maybe you're doing a musical program that needs to have a little more dynamic range to sound more normal and more natural and closer to what you might experience in the real world if you went to a concert or something like that. Which, now again, if you're at a concert, the dynamic range you're experiencing is much greater than you're experiencing on the radio or on a CD or something like that. But once again, there's practical limits to, like, what's pleasant to listen to and what's and what's practical to reproduce on your technology. I mean, just as a really quick aside, I was laughing. I think this is not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but I was listening to an old record. It happened to be the band Supertramp. That there were records from the 70s, and it was an absolutely beautiful sounding record. But I was listening in the car, and I kept finding myself turning it up and down and turning it up and down because it was a beautifully engineered record, but the dynamic range was huge. And then it's like there'd be sections that were really very quiet and detailed and lovely, and then it would really crank really loud. And I'm realizing, like, well, again, people's standards for this change over the years. And so actually sort of listening to that in the car now suddenly sort of felt like, whoa, geez, they really could have compressed that a little bit, just to make those loud parts a little bit less shocking. That being said, if you're sitting in your living room with a beautifully tuned, audiophile hi-fi system, it's really thrilling. It's very exciting. But again, that's one of the things that kind of comes down to, again, with podcasting in particular. People are listening in loud environments very often. They're on a commute, they're in a car, they're on a train, they're listening with earbuds, like you're the not necessarily the sort of ideal listening condition. And so you might want to get everything up a little louder just so that everything's pretty consistent, because again, they're not listening in perfect situations. And so having a little more dynamic range is nice in a perfect world, but we're not living in a perfect world. So yeah, I mean, I hope that sort of makes sense. But largely it's like, again, you're probably thinking about the bits, especially when you're starting a project, when you're recording in the field, and then when you're setting up your project to create and mix. You want to think about those at the beginning, and then you ultimately think about loofs as you're mixing and as you're outputting, so that you're making a product that somebody can listen to, and it's at an expected and pleasant range to listen to. And so pick a loof standard. Hopefully it's one that other people are using. And like, I'm in a circumstance, I'm uploading my shows to PRX. In this circumstance, was a distributor sending these files around to the different radio stations, and I have to hit -24 loofs with my files or they'll reject them. And so it's just one of those things where, because ultimately those files are just going to radio stations, and the reality is now many radio stations are just dropping those files into an automation system, and an engineer may never touch them again. So I have to make sure that they're at the proper level, that they'll sound good on this radio station. The radio station doesn't want me sending them files that are too quiet or too loud. And the same sort of thing, if you're making a podcast, it's probably good. And again, and for instance, I do my radio show at -24, but we do have podcast episodes, and I put those out at -16 just because I realize that, like, that's kind of the standard. And so if somebody's listening to a whole bunch of podcasts in a row, mine's not going to be too quiet because I engineered it at -24, because I'm a nerd for greater dynamic range. I sort of want it to fit in with it. So if people are listening to a series of podcasts, they're not jumping all over the place in volume. And there are technological answers to that may be implemented more and more, where your playback device might regulate the sound a little bit. That's exists a little bit now, but it's still something worth thinking about, that you do want to output an expected level and a level that listeners would appreciate. Which right now, again, if you're doing a general production, a general radio show, I'd do it -24. But if I was doing a podcast, I'd knock it to -18 or -16 loose for distribution.
So much great information. We have one more question. It's going to be our final question, and this is from Adrian here. And I actually think feel free to chime in, but I'm going to answer this a little bit. So the question is, which version of Hindenburg would you recommend for voiceover work, and is there a Hindi version with multi-tracking? So I just want to say to Adrian here that the our other product, which is called Narrator. Sorry, here, I'll just turn on my camera here. Our other product, which is called Narrator, has to do with it was originally made for audiobooks. And I'll let you in a little secret of something that's coming down the pike a little bit. So it syncs text and audio, and we've made some interesting developments with it where the text that voiceover actors need to do that's for video games and other things like that, that text is usually in Excel documents. And so now you're able to do that. You're able to sync that up. So we're kind of and there are other things with that. We'll get to that when we're ready to let the world know about it properly. But that's really the tool for the voiceover artist. But multi-track recording is only available in Pro. Even the light version of Hindenburg, which is to give you access to all the features, not all the features. It doesn't have multi-track. So Pro has multi-track recording. So it sort of depends on what you want to and need to do.
And it's an important distinction to make. That's multi-track recording, in terms of if you're just bringing in mono or stereo files and building a multi-track session, you can do that in any version of Hindenburg Journalist. And it's but it's true, if you need to record a multi-track session in real time, you need multiple channels coming in, more than two. Then indeed, you would need Pro for that. And again, for the use case, for instance, if you're using one of these new podcast production mixers like a Rode Procaster or something like that, you can record internally on that machine and it can send a stereo signal out. But if you want to have all of the tracks available to feed live into Hindenburg, you need Hindenburg Pro to take all those tracks in from there. But if just practically speaking, if you wanted to, those machines can record internally to a drive. And even if you just had the basic version of Journalist, you could take those files in and you could build a multi-track session from those recorded files. It's a little way around the block, but it's still possible. So you can do multi-track productions, but it's just recording in real time. With multi-track, you need Pro for that.
Right. So again, it just kind of depends on what you're needing to do or needing to do more. That is going to wrap it up for us. Just want to say to everybody, please give your digital round of applause here to Jeff Towne. So nice. So much great information.
And for what it's worth, I'll just do one more plug that, again, as someone very, very kindly mentioned in the comments there, that once again, it's like there's so much great information on transom.org that's well beyond what I do. I mean, I do a tiny little segment of all the great info up there. And so if you're doing really any kind of audio production, any kind of storytelling, any kind of documentary work, it's just worth popping around there. There's just all sorts of incredible information up there. And so I would definitely check out Transom and do some reading well beyond my my tiny little tools contribution. So
modest as always. Okay, and we'll send you that promotional check in the mail. That's definitely coming. All the nice words about Hindenburg.
Yeah, I keep hearing that.
Yeah. Any day now.
Like, all right, that is going to do it. A few beers and cocktails. For total transparency, I think I've gotten a few beers and cocktails out of Nick and Brayman and Chris over the years.
All right. Well,
I'll accept that. I'll take that.
Next time I'm in Pennsylvania, the beer's on me.
Good.
And we'll see you all there.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, but once again, but really legitimately, I mean, I am a sincere fan, and once again, I'd be very surprised, even as time has gone by and I've sort of seen there have been conveniences added to some of the other programs. I just don't really see myself changing in the near future. Again, I'd be very surprised. So it's like,
I mean, I think you're just gonna like 2.0 all that much more, honestly. So that's
I
what
anticipate
I'd
that,
imagine. Yeah.
but I guess we're going to find out.
We'll all find out next Monday. So hopefully we'll
Right.
all come to that. All right.
Cool, cool. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and great to chat with everybody. Yeah. Hope it was informative or useful or interesting in some way. Thanks.
It absolutely was. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you soon. We'll see you next Monday.
Sounds
Bye.
great.